All right, this is part B in a series of lectures on the Jesus Seminar. We're resuming on the bottom of page 6 with Funk's observations about this distinction between Jesus and Christ, and that's the same as the Jesus of history versus the Christ of faith. I think that it's a very interesting claim, and let's move over to page 7 now. That certainly bears some evaluation, and that is that what happened within Christianity was that the Jesus of history was replaced by the Christ of the creeds. And I think we know certainly that that following, well after the time of the New Testament and such, that what we have within the creeds represents, these are faith statements. I mean, that's exactly what they are. Of course, the question is whether the Jesus of history was ever really an important part of the New Testament or not, and that's one of the things that they were wrestling with. But it certainly, I think, it bears some attention to note that as the churches began to think more theologically, that certainly those understandings of the meaning of Jesus, the meanings of Jesus, would have begun to supersede any interest in the Christ of history or the Jesus of history. Of course, again, I'm not so sure that the earliest church had a lot of concern for the Jesus of history. That doesn't mean they didn't know anything about the historical Jesus, but I think we could say that their concerns were more Christological than historical. All right, on page 8, he talks about some of the important role that choosing a good text of the New Testament, the Greek text, would play in any kind of search for the historical Jesus. Certainly, the translations, until we get up into the Revised Standard Version, were especially influenced by church theology. And when we get to the New Revised Standard Version in the early 1990s, I believe it was, some of that begins to be freed as there's a closer attention to the actual Greek manuscripts. But deciding which Greek manuscripts they're going to use on which to base their observations became an important issue. So what they did is they decided to develop their own critical edition of the New Testament. And some people will say, "Well, boy, that's egotistical or not," but it's not necessarily at all, really. I mean, there's no doubt there's an awful lot of presumptuousness or presumption among the members of the Jesus Seminar. Again, I think some of that is born out of their bitterness because of the way scholarship was being treated by the church. But nevertheless, it is common practice for scholars to evaluate which versions of the Greek New Testament they're going to use, which versions of chapters and pericopes and such that they were going to use because of the variety within the Greek versions that we have. I think some of the information he's got on page 9 about the various stages of the development of the Greek text of the New Testament bears looking at, and we're not going to spend time on this, but it certainly is important to note the conclusion there that the King James Version was really quite outdated in terms of the Greek manuscripts that it used, even in 1611, but certainly today. So we want to keep that in mind. Now, in the section beginning on bottom of page 9, a map of gospel relationships, here he makes some pretty obvious types of observations, at least obvious to those of us who have spent some time in the New Testament, and every one of you in here is pretty close to that. His observations about the differences between the Synoptic Gospels pictures of Jesus and John's Jesus, I think are perfectly reasonable. Certainly, they barely resemble each other in many respects. He talks beginning on page, we're going to jump over to page 12 now, about the development of the theory that Professor Holtzman, not our Professor Holtzman, but the one back in 1800s anyway, early 1900s, talked about a Q source to explain the double tradition. And he talks in here about how that was not received very well. Page 13, another highlight. I'm assuming you've read this. One of the points he makes here is their claim that Luke preserves best the Q order of sayings and parables as they reconstruct Q. Remember, it's a saying source, collection only of sayings of Jesus. They believe that Luke's gospel preserves best the order of the sayings and parables in that reconstructed Q. There'll be some of us who will ask questions about that, because it seems to me like they are kind of, there's a big leap in logic there, but we'll just move on. Now, on pages 15 and such, he's already been talking about the Gospel of Thomas, and this will play a very important role in the Jesus Seminar's deliberations. Now, remember, as he tells us, that the Gospel of Thomas was one of the Nag Hammadi texts found in Egypt. And we have looked at it, of course, within our course. You have a copy of that in Eliot, in his translation there. Important thing to note here is that the Jesus Seminar assume that Thomas is literarily independent of the Synoptic Gospels, and actually of all the Gospels, the canonical Gospels. Literarily independent again means that the Gospel of Thomas had did not use any of the written forms of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John in the composition of its sayings, in the recording of its sayings. You need to know that is it's a contested claim, and I think rightfully so. But we're not going to debate every one of their claims here. I believe Powell mentions this one. I can't remember. And even if he doesn't, I'm going to mention it, because there's certainly some question about how sure they could be about the order of such things in Q. All right. Now, on page 16 here, we're going to stop for a second and move over into the description of the key elements of the Jesus Seminar's methods. And move now, starting at page 16. These are some pretty important bits of information to note about the how the Jesus Seminar evaluated the sayings by and stories about Jesus in order to grade them with their different colored beads as far as how historically authentic they were. The rules of the written evidence, that's their title on page 16. These are the things that they use to measure the reliability of the evidence. And of course, they assume, like most New Testament historical New Testament scholars do today, that none of the gospel authors were eyewitnesses to what they describe. Just think about that. The logic of that is pretty sound, given the fact that why would Matthew be using Q and Mark if Matthew was an eyewitness to the events? That just doesn't make sense. And we also know that in some cases even Mark could not have been there, because his description of Palestinian geography is, at least on one occasion, pretty seriously flawed. So, but there are other reasons for that. So it's a conclusion of modern scholarship that indeed Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, none of them were eyewitnesses. That doesn't mean that there are no traditions behind them that might have come from eyewitnesses. Now let's skip over to page 19, where he starts talking more specifically about the different types of rules. I hope I didn't skip any. Hang on a second here. Let's see. Nope, I didn't. He's got the very different charts and drawings there. Page 19 talks about some of the rules, well, all the rules that they used in determining historical authenticity. The first one was that the evangelists, these are the bulleted points, these are the ones you want to especially pay attention to, frequently group sayings and parables in clusters and complexes that did not originate with Jesus. You need to know that this observation is very old. It goes back to not very old, but it goes back to the work certainly of Rudolf Bultmann in his form analysis of the New Testament in the 1940s, I want to say, 50s. The separation, the recognition, for example, that some parables might have been spoken in different contexts. We've already talked about that in our study of the parables. This is just one bit of evidence that indicating that or supporting this notion that many of the sayings and stories were grouped together by the evangelists. The best example there, he talks about the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount, but just think of the 5 groupings of teachings that we have in Matthew's Gospel, the 5 that corresponds with the 5 books of the Torah, and that those teachings are found in different places in Mark and also in Luke. Sometimes they're similar, but more often than not, they're grouped differently. That's an important thing to keep in mind, so that we can't just simply rely on the context of a particular saying or story in a given gospel in order to determine whether it's historically authentic or not. We certainly want to consider that, but we need to recognize that there are different locations of some of these sayings and stories in the different gospels. And so, for historical authenticity, we need to keep that in mind. And in fact, the second bullet point on page 19, that the evangelists frequently relocate sayings and parables or invent new narrative context for them, that's just a further explanation, really, in a restatement, I think, of the first bullet. Let's go to page 21. I just want to point this out. I don't know if any of you others caught this or not, but on page 21 on the very top, I'm going to read what the words of Funk here. He says, criticism was originally, and this is historical criticism, directed toward Jesus. Only after Jesus' death would criticism have been aimed at, I'm sorry, he's not talking about historical analysis here. He's talking about criticism of the earliest Christians. Would have originally been directed toward Jesus. Only after Jesus' death would criticism have been aimed at the disciples. Further, the scribes, rather than the Pharisees, were Jesus' opponents. The Pharisees probably did not play a role in Galilee until long after Jesus was gone. I just have to point out that that's a load of cow poop. The work that we've got in Paul's studies, when Paul talks about how he was zealous for the traditions of the fathers, and Jesus' attacks on the elders, the traditions of the elders when he's arguing with the Pharisees, those are all incredibly historically reliable. And so I don't know where the heck Funk and company got this notion from, but it's not held by any contemporary new Jesus scholars of whom I know at all. So it's a very specious claim, and I try to be subjective in my presentations of these things. And I certainly believe there's a lot to learn from the Jesus Seminar, but holy cow, that claim on the top of page 21 about the Pharisees not really being Jesus' opponents just does not stand up to basic historical biblical scholarship. All right, the next couple of bullets on page 21, evangelists frequently expand sayings or parables. That's the first of those. You and I are already used to that. You notice the method to my madness, that you were already analyzing parables to see if there might be some additions or some changes and such. You're already used to this. So again, we've got to consider, before using a parable or a story about Jesus, we need to consider the possibility that it's been altered by the evangelists. If you haven't gotten used to this, by the way, I just realized the evangelists, that's our simple word for the gospel authors. Okay, so when we say the evangelists, we mean the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Also, the evangelists often revise or edit sayings to make them conform to their own individual language, style, or viewpoint. We know redaction analysis, redaction criticism, helps us identify the Christological influences on the way that the gospel authors shape their portrayal of Jesus' sayings. This should not be anything new to you at all. Okay, that's the end of the second lecture. We'll pick up the third one on page 22, false attribution in Funk's writing.